Hello, this is Dr. James P. Camp, Human Anatomy Professor at Lee College in Baytown, Texas, and this is Layers of the Skin. There are three basic layers of the integument. So if we look at the integument as a thick slab, there is from here to about there are three major layers that we see. Above this purple line, there is a layer of tightly packed cells, which, if you recall from our tissue discussion, tightly packed cells usually mean epithelial tissues. Below this purple layer is the main portion of the skin, and then down at the very bottom there is an area made up of largely of fat cells, adipocytes, that would make this adipose tissue. Also found in this area are large blood vessels, arteries, and veins to supply the cutaneous blood flow, to supply blood to the skin. In the middle, you have lots of collagen fibers and also structures such as hair follicles and other structures such as sweat glands and various other things that nervous structures and other nervous structures. We'll talk in another presentation about all these different structures in the middle of the skin, but right now I just want to focus on the three layers. The main layer here is referred to as the dermis, which is of course Greek for skin. It would make sense then that this layer on top of the dermis would be known as the epidermis, epi meaning upon or on top of or outside of. So this is the outer layer, the upper layer, the outer layer of the skin. Following that logic then, the layer below the dermis would be known as, using the prefix hypo for under, the hypodermis. The hypodermis, though, has another name. It is also known as the subcutaneous layer, or sub-Q, as it's sometimes known for short. That is because the epidermis plus the dermis make up something called the cutaneous membrane of the skin, the layer that is actually technically skin. And for that, in that sense, the hypodermis is a subcutaneous layer, a layer under the cutaneous membrane. The dermis, we'll subdivide the epidermis in the next slide. The dermis can be subdivided into two areas as well. If you look at this little region right here, it's an area where the dermis repeatedly pokes up into the epidermis. Those little places where the epidermis pokes up into where the dermis pokes up into the epidermis are known as dermal papillae, So this region is called the papillary dermis. Papilla is sort of a anatomical word for a bump. So it's the bumpy dermis in a way. That's about 10% of the thickness of the dermis. The other 90% of the thickness of the dermis is known for having these crisscrossing collagen fiber shapes. And one name for a crisscrossing shape is a reticulation. So this is known as the reticular dermis here. All right, so in summary, we have the epidermis on top. We'll subdivide that into some layers on the next slide. We have the dermis, which is divided into the upper papillary dermis and the lower reticular dermis. And then we have the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, which is mostly fat with a number of very large blood vessels in it. The papillary dermis mostly contains little tiny blood capillaries, such as I've drawn in here, that exist to feed the epidermis. Remember, epidermal epithelial tissues rather have no blood supply of their own. Whereas the reticular dermis contains all of these more interesting structures like sweat glands and hair follicles and nervous system structures and the like, which we'll cover in a different presentation. All right, for the next slide, we're going to zoom in on a little chunk of the epidermis. When we look at the epidermis, there are 5 layers which are known as strata. Stratum is a Latin word for layer. So we start here at the bottom looking at this wavy line here, the dermal papillae poking up into the epidermis. And the first layer is just a thin layer of cells that lives on top of the dermal papillae here. They're roughly cuboidal. They're cuboidal, roughly square-shaped cells. And these are the stem cells, largely these are the stem cells of the skin, the cells that are capable of dividing to replenish all the cells we lose at the top. For you lose over 1 million skin cells a day from the top of your skin. This layer is known as the stratum basale because it is the basal layer, the base layer of the skin. One up from there, we have a large number of cells that make that slowly transition from kind of a jumbled mess of cells down here in these cracks here, cells that look more like the stratum basale cells, and that slowly transition into bigger, wider cells here that are starting to look more like squamous cells. The cells in this area are known for having little accumulations of protein around the outside that make them look spiny. And so this layer is known as the stratum spinosum. At this point, as we're moving from the stratum basale up through the stratum spinosum, as I mentioned, the stem cells of the skin are down here in the stratum basale, and so as they divide, their daughter cells move up into the stratum spinosum, and so what we have here is a constant movement of cells up toward the surface of the skin. as the cells move up through the stratum spinosum, they begin to accumulate a protein called keratin. Keratin is a dry, hard protein that protects our skin from abrasion and from dehydration and from other kinds of damage. At this point, then we start making a change, and we start seeing layers of big, wide, brick-like cells that are starting to fill with keratin, not just at the edges like the spinosum cells, but really all through these cells we'll notice accumulations of keratin. Okay, and it's really the ultimate kind of taking one for the team here, because as these cells accumulate more and more keratin, it crowds out, it's a dry, hard protein, it crowds out the room that the cell needs for doing all of its cell business. These cells are slowly dying from accumulating all of this keratin in them. And so this is known as the stratum corneum. No. This is known as the stratum granulosum, for all of the granules of keratin that are starting to build up in these cells. At this point, our skin has a choice. Okay, it can either, if it's in most of the body, it's going to become what we call thin skin. Okay, which means it's going to have a thinner set of layers. If it's in the palm of the hand or the plantar surface of the foot, it's going to become what we call thick skin. Thick skin is going to accumulate a thicker set of skin layers, and it's also going to accumulate one extra layer that none of the other skin cells have, which is this layer of kind of brightly colored brick-like cells that just stand out under a microscope as being very brightly colored, full of light. And so the word for these is the stratum lucidum. Lucid meaning full of light. And that's only found in the thick skin. Then, whether you're thick skin or thin, you're going to finally end up with a layer of dead cells that are completely full of keratin. Some of these cells might start flaking off a little bit. You might see, discontinuous patches in this skin surface as the cells start flaking off. You'll see about 2 or 3 or 4 layers on the thin skin. On the thick skin, you'll see very many layers of these keratinized cells. And we call them cells very loosely because they're dead. They do not have a nucleus anymore. They don't have any of the organelles that keep skin alive, that keep a cell alive. They're just bags of keratin protein. And then this top layer, whether it's on the thin skin or the thick skin, is known as the stratum corneum. Corn meaning horn in Latin, like the horn of a cow or a sheep or something, which are actually made out of keratin as well. So this is the dry, hard, horny layer or horn-like layer of the skin. Okay, so in this last slide, I want to look at the cell types that are found in the epidermis. So recall once again that we have at the bottom this stratum basale here. Okay, I mentioned that most of the cells in the stratum basale are essentially stem cells of the skin. So our first cell type that we're going to find are skin stem cells, which are constantly dividing to produce new cells that will move up through the layers of the skin here to replenish the cells that are lost at the top. But there are two other kinds of cells that are found here in the stratum basale. One is a sort of balloon-like cell that is attached to a nerve ending down on that proceeds down into the dermis. This used to be called a Merkel cell. We now refer to them functionally as tactile cells. Okay, and a tactile cell is a cell that senses very light touch. Things that just barely touch the surface of the skin are felt by tactile cells. There are then several more layers of touch that we'll talk about in a future lecture. The next type of cell that's found here that's a little bit different is a cell that has sort of little spines poking out in various places and is usually a lot darker looking than the cells around it. This cell is a melanocyte. Okay, melanocytes are the cells that make the protein melanin. Okay, so there are essentially two core proteins made in our skin. Keratin is the hard, dry, protective protein that makes the stratum corneum of the epidermis. It also makes the core of your hair and the substance of all of your fingernails. Melanin, on the other hand, is a dark pigment that acts to absorb UV light. And the point of melanin is to prevent the other cells of your skin from being damaged too much by UV sunlight. Okay, so what are those other cells of your skin? As the skin stem cells mature, they make their way up and become, increasingly broad, flat cells. These cells that will ultimately form the granulosum and the stratum corneum, these are keratinocytes. Okay, and so keratin, melanocytes make melanin, keratinocytes make keratin. Most of the cells, probably 99% of the cells in your skin, are keratinocytes. And what happens is the melanocytes make little beads, little vesicles of pigment that they release, and those into the spaces between the keratinocytes. And as the keratinocytes move their way up toward the surface of the skin, they take in that pigment melanin, and that's what gives your skin its color. People from ancestry closer to the equator, African and Hispanic and other such peoples, tend to have much darker forms of melanin in their body, whereas people from very northern climates, northern Europe, for example, tend to have very much lighter melanin. And the reason we suspect for that is an evolutionary one. We suspect that If you lived near the equator, you got more sun damage to your skin, so you needed a darker melanin to protect yourself. If you lived farther away from the equator, far up north, you got much less sunlight, and so you needed a lighter color melanin that wouldn't absorb the sunlight you need to help your skin cells make vitamin D, for example. Okay, so I've now introduced 4 of the 5 cell types. There's one other cell type in your skin, and that's sort of the paramedic of the skin. These are cells that live in between other skin cells. These are cells that live in between other skin cells, and they have little processes that stick out that look kind of like tree branches. And the Greek word for a tree branch, or for a tree, is dendros. So these are called dendritic cells. And they are essentially immune system cells that live in the epidermis, trying to prevent or repair skin damage and to detect when any infectious organisms might be trying to get into the skin through the epidermis. Okay, that concludes our lecture on layers of the skin. We'll have another short lecture in class on the fine structures of the epidermis. We'll have another lecture in class on the large structures found in the dermis, such as the glands and other structures of the dermis.